live from Mitchell Hall at the University of Delaware. This is Delaware Debates.
Welcome. On behalf of Delaware Public Media, WDDE 91.1 FM, and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication, welcome to Delaware Debates 2014, made possible with the financial support of the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. I'm Nancy Karibjanian. Joining me to co-moderate this debate is Lindsay Hoffman, University of Delaware Professor of Communication and Political Science. The candidates in this race for the U.S. Senate include Democrat Chris Coons, the incumbent, and Republican Kevin Wade. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Tonight's debate will be divided into two parts. Following a 1-minute opening statement from each of our candidates, Lindsay Hoffman and I will pose questions to the candidates. Responses in this section are limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds with a 1-minute rebuttal, and then there will be the opportunity for a moderated discussion. The second part of our debate includes questions posed by students from the University of Delaware and Delaware State University. Responses in this portion are limited to 1 minute. Each candidate will also have 1 minute for a closing statement. Now, our live studio audience here in the Mitchell Hall Theater on the University of Delaware's Newark campus understands that there will be no applause during tonight's debate. We did hold a coin toss just prior to coming out this evening to determine our order, and that determined that we will begin with Chris Coons, who has the first opening statement.
Well, thank you to the University of Delaware and Delaware Public Media for hosting tonight's debate. I'm running for my first full term in the Senate because I want to continue working for creative solutions to the real challenges that we face here in Delaware and across our country. I've worked hard to bring the Delaware way to Washington. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Washington is a very frustrating place to work these days. Congress spends most of its time fighting over manufactured crises. But I've been doing things differently, working with people of both parties on things that really matter to Delawareans. Helping the private sector to grow good middle-class jobs, increasing access to college and skills training, ensuring all Delawareans have a fair shot at the American dream. We're a state of neighbors that demands principled compromise and values results over fighting. These are the things Americans and Delawareans expect from their elected officials. We also expect to have nights like this one, where we hear from our candidates in person, in a civil discourse, and learn about their vision, their values, and their priorities. And I look forward to that conversation tonight.
And now the opening statement from Kevin Wade.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Wade. Tonight, my opponent, Chris Coons, will speak of his 4 years in Washington. He'll mention again and again his programs and his legislative record. He'll speak of Washington committees and subcommittees, but he won't talk about his success in solving the problems of Delaware. You and I will have a different conversation. You see, tonight I will be speaking about us and the life that we share here in Delaware. I wasn't lucky enough to be born in Delaware, but I got here as quick as I could. I earned an electrical engineering degree right here at this university. And my wife of 36 years, you may know her on campus as Dr. Gail Wade, has dedicated her life as a nurse and professor to maternal and child health, helping newborn babies and young moms. But tonight is about you. We talk about the problems and common sense solutions, and we'll talk about getting through these difficult times together, no one left behind.
Please understand that it'll be my job to keep us on time throughout the evening. I'm not being rude, but that is my responsibility. So let's move to our first topic, and our first topic is the question to Mr. Coons, and we're going to start with foreign policy. You know, it clearly emerges as the paramount concern for our nation, you know, from the handling of Ebola to the rising threat of ISIS. You can put a pin on the map of global unrest, but it wouldn't be easy to figure out where to put that pin. But the civil war in Syria is perhaps a good place for us to start, and the implications of U.S. actions there. So that's our starting point. An opinion piece in last week's New York Times asked the question whether Syria will be President Obama's Vietnam. Is the U.S., with the use of airstrikes on ISIS, on the edge of that slippery slope to a new phase of U.S. military involvement in the region?
We are at the beginning of a new phase of military involvement in the Middle East by having started airstrikes against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. But I believe the Congress has a constitutional role in demanding of the administration a strategy that is sound, that is winnable, that has the support of the American people, of insisting that we pay for this war and that we make sure that there is a route towards a clear and important victory against this terrorist group which has demonstrated their intention to massacre civilians, to behead Americans, and to threaten our interests in the region and globally. In order to make sure this is not another Vietnam, to your question, Nancy, I think we on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have an important role to insist on a clear strategy being laid out, to insist on our taking up and voting an authorization of the use of force, and to stay actively engaged in the oversight of the conduct of our combat against ISIS.
Mr. Wade, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, I think if you had to put a pin on the problem, you'd pin Washington, D.C. In the past 4 years, we have drifted dangerously away from a world that had some elements of common sense and security, some structure to it, to a world that's spinning wildly out of control, violence sweeping through the Mideast. I don't know how we would consider our foreign relations at this point in this nation's life, but there are dangers coming from every direction, a broken border, Ebola in this country. And I have not heard a plan that looks like it leads to success in the Middle East. I've heard something that looks less like Eisenhower at Normandy and more like Colonel Custer at the Little Bighorn. So I won't give my yes to a war powers resolution until I hear that we have a plan for success. And I know that the people of the United States are unified and ready for the long and very bitter struggle that follows.
We're now moving into the moderated discussion on this point.
Well, moving on to another national security issue, the Ebola crisis. Nearly 2/3 of Americans are concerned about a widespread Ebola epidemic in the United States, with recent news that 2 Texas healthcare workers are infected. How can you reassure Delawareans that the issue is under control? Mr. Coons.
Well, we have a significant, raging public health crisis in 3 West African countries. And in order to reassure Delawareans that the situation is as under control as we can responsibly make it, I want to report that I've spoken with both the head of the CDC, Dr. Tom Frieden, who is responsible for the public health and safety of the United States, and folks from the United States and Delaware's response, from the hospitals, the nurses, the public health service that's responsible for keeping Delaware safe. We have a significant concern ahead of us, and we need to invest more in making sure we've got the resources, we've got the training, and we've got the equipment in America's hospitals to effectively respond.
I just want to remind, this is discussion point. There is no time except for the full discussion limit, so you may contribute to the conversation at this point.
The first problem is not money or equipment, it's a lack of leadership. My opponent, Chris Coons, sent out a tweet a few days ago telling America not to freak out about a single death in America from Ebola. And now 2 more people have become infected.
Well, let me let him clarify if that's what the tweet stated.
Mr. Wade misunderstands or mischaracterizes perhaps. This was a tweet that was forwarding an article that was entitled, "Don't Freak Out About a Single Death." Let me be clear. We should take very seriously even a single death in the United States. The larger point of the article that was being forwarded with that title was that we need to tackle Ebola where it is out of control in West Africa, at the same time that we are investing in making sure that the United States is equipped and prepared to respond where there are instances of Ebola being brought to the United States or where American health workers contract Ebola.
Could you compare the lack of early response to Ebola, what happened with AIDS?
I'd like to speak to this. We don't have a confirmed United States Surgeon General. That position has been open and filled by basically an acting Surgeon General for nearly a year. That's not the role of the U.S. House of Representatives. That's a constitutional role of the U.S. Senate. That spot has been empty, and we don't have leadership in Washington.
That's right.
And that falls directly on you, Senator Harry Reid, and the Democrat Congress.
To be clear,
it's a leadership problem.
The exact reason why we do not have a confirmed Surgeon General today is Republican obstructionism. The nominee to be Surgeon General made a comment about gun violence being a public health crisis in the United States, and he has been blocked from getting a vote by Republicans in the Senate. So I would agree with Mr. Wade that it is a challenge for us that we have not been able to fill senior positions in this administration for years because Republicans in the Senate have refused to allow us to get to a vote. We do need a Surgeon General, and there is a nominee who is competent, qualified, and could help lead in this crisis.
We're going to take our next topic on, and Lindsay will have the first question to you, Mr. Wade.
Very good.
Mr. Wade, while national security and foreign policy issues have become a big part of the national conversation, jobs and the economy still remain one of the foremost issues on voters' minds. A recent poll said that 41% of Americans report economic issues as the most important problem facing the country. What will you do to ease Americans' concerns about the economy?
Well, I've offered a plan to put between 5,000 and 10,000 workers in Delaware to work, specifically blue-collar jobs, jobs for welders and pipe fitters and electricians and payroll clerks and drivers. I'm an engineer, I run a business. I know how to make 2 and 2 equal 4. 150 miles north of here, we have North America's largest natural gas reserves. It's the cheapest natural gas in the world. We are a port state. We are uniquely positioned. And across the Atlantic Ocean are 300 million customers waiting to buy our natural gas. Let's put this together. Let's create 5,000 to 10,000 jobs right here in Delaware and solve the problem by leadership and common sense. Thank you.
Mr. Coons, a 1-minute rebuttal on the topic.
I spent 8 years in a successful manufacturing company here in Newark, Delaware, and I've taken both what I learned from that experience and from visiting with manufacturers up and down the state to develop a bipartisan agenda to strengthen manufacturing in the Senate. I've introduced bills, we've had hearings, we've had a number of those bills turned into law. The best way we can move forward in our economy isn't just focusing on one particular niche like natural gas exports, as desirable as that may be, but a broader approach that helps build the middle class by investing in skills and training, access to capital, access to export markets, and strengthening the overall American economy.
We can now move into moderated discussion on the point of the economy.
Well, Mr. Wade, you said that we're in sort of what you called a zombie economy.
That's exactly right.
That the most recent federal jobs report found that employers actually added 248,000 jobs last month, and the unemployment rate dropped, crossing below 6% for the first time since before the recession. Would you still describe this as a zombie economy that isn't alive and healthy?
And the stock market dropped 200 or 300 points today, and in June we created about 284,000 new jobs in June, a good number until you dig more deeply and find out that 275,000 or so were part-time. People have full-time bills. They can't get by with part-time jobs. And the Affordable Care Act, frankly, is behind a lot of this separation of America into two Americas, a full-time America and a part-time America, and I intend to fix that.
I think Mr. Wade somewhat misunderstands the impact of the Affordable Care Act on providing access to health care, in many cases for the first time, for those who are working at the lower rungs of our economy, those who are seeking to get up on the first rung of success. But let me just say more broadly, you make a good point. The hundreds of thousands of jobs created in the last month, the steady drop in the unemployment rate do point to a steadily strengthening economic recovery, month over month, year over year. We've succeeded in Washington in making tough choices that have cut our deficit by 2/3 over the last 4 years. And we've succeeded in Delaware in investing in the things the private sector needs to grow more strongly. I am optimistic about our economic future, but we haven't yet made enough progress for all Americans.
Is there not a concern, though, that if you boost the minimum wage to a point, employers will then opt to do more with less? That's been the trend. And so job creation will begin to slow down because you have to pay your employees too much.
There is a point where you can raise the minimum wage too much, but I support raising the minimum wage. It hasn't been raised in years. And the idea that folks should work full-time and still be in poverty, to me, defies sort of basic common sense, the values that underlie the American economy, that we should reward work. I think the smarter thing for us to do is to not just raise the minimum wage, but also index it to inflation so that we don't go through decades where it stays stagnant and loses buying power and then jumps and then loses buying power.
The smarter thing to do is to create jobs in Delaware. We've seen an erosion of middle-class income. We've seen the impact of the Affordable Care Act. Congressman Carney mentioned that he had to do a carve-out to save 500 jobs at Cigna right here in Delaware because of the Affordable Care Act. You have a TV commercial where you help firemen. I salute you for that. But why didn't you help the rest of the people in Delaware? My small business had our health insurance canceled. We've carried insurance for 30 years. It was canceled because of Obamacare. A friend of mine, Sean, in Newark, just in June had his final coverage expired because of Obamacare. And people are being forced into paying for policies they don't want at prices they can't afford. And that's the nature of this two-part economy, full-time and part-time. It's not the minimum wage, it's the Affordable Care Act.
I don't want to leave this topic on the table without giving Mr. Coons a chance to respond to that.
Well, I think Mr. Wade mischaracterizes the impact of the Affordable Care Act, but let's agree. that the work that I've done across the aisle to make sure that unintended impacts of the Affordable Care Act on our volunteer fire service was an important effort that was made possible by bipartisanship. There are other things we can and should to deal with unintended impacts, but broadly speaking, 8 million more Americans having health insurance and having access to quality, affordable health care is a good thing.
Well, balancing the budget, it is perhaps Washington's unicorn. It sounds good in speeches, it looks really good on paper, and it does please a fiscally conscious constituency. But is it realistic, especially considering the uncertainty of our economy and the political climate in Washington?
Well, I've never heard balancing the budget described as a unicorn before, so that's a new mental image for me to take into budget committee meetings. I will say that actually balancing the budget again, which we last did in 2000, where we actually had a surplus, will take enormous sacrifices and very difficult choices. At a time when we are going back to war in the Middle East, and when we have a significant number of veterans returning home after 14 years of conflict, and when we have an aging population, we have significant costs on the federal balance sheet. The progress that we've made in reducing the deficit and in making it a sustainable deficit, I think is well worth noting, but going forward, I don't expect us to achieve a balanced budget in the next 5 years because the changes we would have to make to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are unacceptable and wouldn't be supported by the American people, and the depth of the cuts we'd have to make to our defense program would equally be unsustainable. I don't foresee a balanced budget in the short term.
Mr. Wade, a 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, we can't balance the budget in the short term, but we can certainly get started immediately on balancing the budget over the long term. I've proposed what's called the penny plan. And I asked Washington to do what moms and dads around Delaware can do, in the next 2 weeks, and that is to cut 1 penny from each dollar in federal spending and make that cut once a year. So cut 1 penny out of each dollar this year, and we'll give Washington 12 months, not 2 weekends, but 12 months to find that second penny in the second year. Year by year, 1 penny by 1 penny, while we let revenues naturally increase, and somewhere between 6 and 10 years from now, by mathematical certainty, we will have zeroed out the deficit. And then, Nancy, we can get to work on that real problem of, well, a 50-year plan to eliminate the federal debt. But we need to get started, and it needs to be based on common sense. That's the penny plan.
We are now into the portion of moderated discussion. I don't know if we want to allow you a chance to respond to that or if you want to change us to a new aspect of the issue.
I'll say briefly that the penny plan, which was first proposed by Senator Lindsay of Wyoming, is appealing in its simplicity, but misses a basic point, which I just made, which is that we have steadily increasing costs facing the federal government. So to take our current baseline and cut from there misses the fact that simply to meet our obligations to our veterans, to our seniors, to those who rely on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which is more than 1/3 of all Delawareans, can't be achieved by steadily cutting from today's baseline.
Well, as we continue this conversation, Lindsay Hoffman can move us to a different point within this realm.
Sequestration. I think we talked about the unicorn. This is maybe the elephant. The sequestration that resulted from the congressional failure to reach a deal on deficit reduction in 2011 has led to annual automatic defense cuts. Given the increasingly violent nature of the situation in Syria and Iraq, should more money be allocated to the armed forces?
Yes.
Sequestration took a chainsaw to something that needed a scalpel. Washington had months and years to address spending problems in Washington, and instead they reached a quick deal that the President of the United States was behind and later complained about, and it's going to leave us with a United States Army with fewer troops than we had in 1940, and a Navy smaller than we had in 1915 as problems swirl around the world. Now, there are cuts to be found in defense. There are cuts to be found everywhere. There's waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the federal government. It's easy to get that penny, but we have to do some real thinking to come up with real priorities for our nation today in this crisis and down the road into the future. And we're not getting that out of Washington.
Where's our infrastructure fit into this? 495 is a minor example. It was not caused by neglect to maintain the roadway. However, if you ask any civil engineer, they're telling you the clock is ticking and we are on the verge of a huge infrastructure crisis on our nation's highways. Is it just going to stay on the back burner?
I hope not. We managed to get a bipartisan highway infrastructure bill passed in the recent Senate. And we do agree on a bipartisan basis that we need to increase both public investment and leverage private investment to make sure that we catch up on some of our antiquated and outdated infrastructure, but we're not getting there fast enough. You point to a central issue, which is the investments we need to make in order for America to be competitive again against other countries like China and others that are investing heavily in world-class modern infrastructure. The United States needs to invest in education, in research, and in infrastructure to be competitive.
I want to give you a chance to come in. We have just under 30
as the only
top.
engineer sitting here, Nancy, I'll remind the audience that in 2009, $850 billion of the taxpayers' money was authorized for a stimulus program, and the primary central focus was infrastructure. What happened to $850 billion? We need new management in Washington, not more of the same. We need to take a new path.
All right, we'll move on to our next topic with Lindsay.
Well, we've talked about health care, the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Wade, let's move on to this topic. Grade the impact of the Affordable Care Act and explain your position.
Well, I've run a small business for 30 years. I started it on a kitchen table. It gives me a unique perspective about balancing budgets and making decisions, and in fact, coming up with engineering solutions that work. And in September of 2013, after 30 years of providing, well, I think, high-quality insurance to our employees at no cost to them, I received a cancellation notice. I called my insurance broker. I said, what's going on? I was told it's the Obamacare. It's Obamacare. I said, I have less than 50 employees, and the president told me if I liked my insurance, I could keep it. And they said, well, the insurance industry is in chaos and turmoil, and you and many other small businesses are being canceled. I'm hearing this story around Delaware. It's not a benefit to most people. There were 12,000 policies canceled, and that's 20 or 25,000 people. I was speaking to an iron worker not a week ago. His premiums have gone to $2,400 a month, Senator. Now, you were able to define a partial waiver for your staff and you. But Delaware needs a waiver. All of us need a waiver. It's a beast, and it needs to be put down. It hurts people today, and it'll hurt people tomorrow. Obamacare needs to be repealed, and we need to bring back the market-based insurance system and also bring what I call neighbor health to provide a way for people who want insurance, who don't have it, to earn it in the community by voluntary service.
1 minute rebuttal, Mr. Coons.
That's a lot to rebut in 1 minute, Nancy. Let's go back to where we were before the Affordable Care Act and remind folks that 90,000 Delawareans had no health insurance, and that equally, if not more importantly, tens of thousands of Delawareans who earned health insurance through their employer only discovered it didn't work when they really needed it. Pre-existing conditions. So folks who survived cancer would be denied insurance as their reward for having survived cancer. Women could be discriminated against in health insurance rates simply for being women. Pregnancy could be a pre-existing condition. Parents could give birth to a child who survived weeks in the NICU only to discover they had a lifetime cap or an annual cap. Our insurance program that my opponent says was so terrific and wonderful before the Affordable Care Act had significant problems. There are challenges for small business, and I'm working with the insurance commissioner and have introduced legislation to deal with some of the very real impacts on small business. But the larger goal of expanding access to high-quality health care, I believe the Affordable Care Act has made progress in meeting.
And a follow-up?
Well, Mr. Wade, about the Neighbor Help program, you said that people who've lost their jobs should be able to obtain affordable health insurance, and to propose this volunteer program where citizens would volunteer 20 to 30 hours a week in exchange for health insurance
20 or 30 hours a month, Lindsay, a month.
So, well, how would you enact this program?
By leadership and talking to my colleagues in the U.S. Senate and over in the House, and knock on the door of the White House and say, we have an idea that America wants. People who have lost their job haven't lost their working skills. Can we understand that? If you were a bookkeeper, you still have bookkeeping skills. If you're an electrician, you still have electrician skills. And every community has needs. So let's put the people who have those job skills but don't have jobs to work in the community, if they choose that. And in return for 20 or, 30 hours a month, we'll pay their health insurance premium. It's not low cost, it's free, but it's voluntary. Allow the rest of us to get back to something that we could afford. If Obamacare was so good, why did he ask for a waiver? And why does he brag about doing carve-outs for some?
I want to make sure we get discussion in on this point, because clearly we don't want to be left with 5 seconds at the end.
Well, let me speak to an untruth that Mr. Wade's repeated now twice. The members of Congress, by the terms of the Affordable Care Act, are covered by it. we had to switch to buying our insurance for ourselves and our families and our staff through the exchanges. I had personally the experience of going online and trying to buy through the exchanges and learning some of the frustrations of the initial enrollment period. The Affordable Care Act, which was enacted by the Senate 2 years before I got there, is not perfect, but I think it has made significant and realistic progress towards a major goal: making the insurance that many of us earn through our employment really work when we need it, and providing access to affordable insurance for those who didn't previously have it.
So what do you think you could do? How can you improve this Affordable Care Act?
There's a number of bills that I've already agreed to co-sponsor, so I'll just mention two if I could. One of them, Senator Begich is the lead sponsor on, expands the tax credits available to small employers so that they can afford to continue providing health insurance. I'll remind you, some of the minimum coverage requirements of the Affordable Care Act mean that you have to provide broader and more robust coverage than you would have before as an employer. So making that affordable to an employer is a key piece that we are still obviously working out the details. Second, I joined with Senator Pryor in a way to make exemptions for certain religious organizations that, as a matter of faith, don't access the modern healthcare system. I was disappointed that as the campaign season began, our two Republican co-sponsors walked away from the bill. It's my hope that after the election, if I'm reelected, I'll have a chance to work across the aisle on many of the different ways we can deal with the part-time, full-time problem, the 50 versus 100 employer challenges, and the costs for small business.
All right, we're going to move on to our next topic then, since there's not enough time to continue a discussion on that point. And this is about education, and it goes to you, Mr. Coons. Common Core is under fire. And even though it was initiated at the state level by the National Governors Association, it is seen as a precursor to what some feel is a federal takeover of the public education system. Some critics are dubbing it Obama Core. How valid do you see this criticism, since it could be argued that it is somewhat on point, that the goal of Common Core is to set a baseline standard nationally?
Well, the idea of a baseline national standard for the skills that young people should get upon completing high school, the things they should learn, where that standard has been developed in a collaborative conversation between state education leaders and governors, doesn't frighten me. In fact, what I hear from educators and manufacturers and employers up and down the state of Delaware is that there's long been a yearning for a clear roadmap for what it is that young people should be learning at different stages so that we can measure their skills and their progress. This isn't a Washington mandate, and this isn't a Washington takeover of education. But it's important for us to be attentive to that as a legitimate concern. Unlike many other countries, we don't have a centralized national education bureaucracy. Education is still largely funded and driven at the state level. And here in Delaware, we've been blessed to have a governor and a secretary of education, and in the DSEA, a union that represents most of our teachers, that have worked well together to implement significant changes. I am optimistic that as long as we keep on an equal basis the importance of educating children and respecting teachers as professionals, while still providing for the private sector an education that produces the skills we need in the modern workplace, that we can keep making progress. I frankly think calling Common Core Obama Core is trying to glom on a Fox News cynical take on education to something that was started at the state level and has real promise.
Mr. Wade, a 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, I'd like to ask the senator at what state level was it applied, because this is a universal recipe to teach every kid in public school the same thing in the same way without distinguishing between Louisiana and Maine, Florida and Alaska. I'll remind our audience that when we walked on the moon and returned those men home, we didn't have Common Core. Common Core actually delays the onset of algebra from the 8th grade to the 9th grade. Do you think that China and India, Germany and Korea are delaying algebra? One of the leading advocates and proponents for Common Core is Bill Gates. He created millions of jobs. He's a brilliant man and a college dropout, I'll add. But the most important thing to take away from this discussion is Bill Gates sends his children to one of the most exclusive private schools on the West Coast. And that school on their website says, "We don't teach Common Core."
I want to remind you both that during our moderated discussion, you do not need to wait. You're allowed to actually discuss the question. So let me jump off of what you just said and ask both of you, what education choices have you made for your families? Where are your children? Where have your children attended school? And I believe you have grandchildren as well. What is the education landscape for you?
My children go to Wilmington Friends School. My wife is Catholic, I'm Protestant. She grew up in parochial schools. I grew up in public school through 8th grade. And as we started raising our own children, we went and looked at a wide range of public, parochial, and private schools, and ended up settling on Wilmington Friends because we really liked its balance of values, of diversity, and of educational excellence.
Our daughter went to Our Lady of Fatima up to the 8th grade. It's a parochial school. We're not Roman Catholic, we're Protestants, but we value the foundation that they use to teach and the principles that live in that school while it existed. Unfortunately, it closed because the economy made it too difficult for too many parents to get that tuition. And then she went to Ursuline Academy, and now she's married with 2 wonderful grandchildren for Gail and I, and they're in public school down in Middletown. But they've now decided they want to do what they can to maybe get out of the public school system. They're very disappointed with Common Core as they now understand it. And that reaction is taking place across Delaware. And because it is a centralized system designed by Washington, it is Obamacare for education with the same results.
I think that's a good point to bring up a poll that the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication actually released today, which finds that Delaware residents give mediocre grades to the state's public schools, but higher grades to the private school system. What would you do to ensure a good education for all children in Delaware?
Is that my question?
You can both do moderated discussion.
What I've proposed is very simple. Equal opportunity universal vouchers. Every parent has one chance to educate his children. One chance. It costs $14,000 a year to educate a child. In the Delaware Public Schools, even under Common Core, a $10,000 voucher available to every parent of every child allows them to have the full range of opportunities that, well, my daughter has and the senator's children have.
What would I do to ensure equality of opportunity and to strengthen our schools? Continue to invest in teachers as professionals. Respect teachers and respect teaching as a profession. My mother and grandmother were public school teachers at different points in their careers. Second, do more to engage parents in education. Parents today are often stretched, working 2 jobs and juggling different children in different schools. The National PTA gave me an award for my leadership on parent-teacher engagement. I've introduced legislation to try and strengthen our investment in parent engagement centers in our schools. Third, better align employers and the future needs of our workforce with what we're teaching in schools. Whether it's in VOTEC or in traditional high schools, whether it's in charter schools or private schools, we need to have a better sense of what the skills are that are needed in the modern workforce. And then last, make sure that we are making children aware of, and their parents aware of, the costs of higher education and making access to college more affordable and more equal.
Lindsay will move us to our next topic.
Mr. Wade.
Sure.
Last month, the Gallup poll released the numbers on America's ratings of Congress. The 14% approval rating is the lowest measured before a midterm election since 1974. If Republicans gain control of Senate in this election, commentators have said we can expect to see even more partisanship on Capitol Hill for the next 2 years. How do you plan to fulfill your campaign promises in such a climate?
Well, I've told people up and down Delaware, I'm not going there to be the Republican senator from Delaware, and I certainly won't be the Democrat senator from Delaware. I promise to be the independent voice. Now, my opponent has voted with his party leadership, Harry Reid, 97% of the time, and that's not being bipartisan, that's being part of the logjam. I'll work as an engineer in my life with anyone who has a solution. Liberal, conservative, center, Democrat, Republican. If it works, I want to get behind it. Our problems are great, and we need some common sense solutions now, and that's my promise to Delaware, and I keep my promises.
1 minute rebuttal.
Well, I have a real record to talk about here. As a freshman senator, I committed myself to doing something legislatively or in a policy way with each of my 2010 classmates, 13 of whom were Republicans. And I was recently named the 3rd most bipartisan Democratic senator. I've introduced legislation with more than 35 members of the Republican caucus. So my opponent might cite some rating in terms of how many times I vote with my leader. That's correct when we're talking about confirming judges, confirming ambassadors, naming post offices. But in some ways, the vote that matters most will be the vote cast on the first day. Will he be voting for Mitch McConnell as leader? I suspect he will. Will I be voting for the Democratic caucus to lead? I will, because I stand by Democratic values. I will continue to fight for raising the minimum wage, for dealing with the equality gap, for investing in manufacturing, and for strengthening our economy, because those are the things I think Delaware expects of me.
Well, one issue that falls clearly along party lines is birth control. This summer, the Supreme Court ruled that the craft store Hobby Lobby could opt out of providing birth control coverage to their employees for religious reasons. Personally, do you agree or disagree with this decision, Mr. Coons?
I disagree with this decision. I think that the recent developments by the Supreme Court in Citizens United and in Hobby Lobby to extend to corporations First Amendment rights that I think were previously understood as only attaching to real people is an unfortunate direction for the court to have taken. Hobby Lobby isn't just some small family craft store. It's a multi-billion-dollar nationwide company. And while I respect the strongly held religious views of the family that owns this large company, I think decisions about a woman's access to contraception should be made in her doctor's office, not in a corporate boardroom. And I don't follow the logic of the Supreme Court in this case or in Citizens United, where they insist that corporations have the same free speech rights.
Well, let me set the record straight, if I could. That decision denied no woman birth control. Not a single woman was denied birth control because of that. It was a decision about freedom. It was a decision about freedom. Employees of Hobby Lobby were not prevented from going to a pharmacy and, under their with the doctor's prescription and buying inexpensive birth control. So let's not frame it that way. It was about freedom, Senator. And since you mentioned the First Amendment, let me bring up the point that George Will, one of the most respected columnists in this country, who writes for the Washington Post, one of the most respected newspapers, specifically named you, Delaware Senator Coons, as an extremist for attempting in the Senate to redefine the First Amendment of the Constitution. It was about freedom, and that was a good ruling.
Let's be clear. I joined many senators in supporting a constitutional amendment that would restore the previous balance before Citizens United that allowed for responsible and reasonable regulations on campaign contributions. Citizens United took out more than a century of precedent and has opened a floodgate to literally hundreds of millions of dollars of secret campaign contributions from corporations, labor unions, and very wealthy individuals. While I respect our difference of opinion on what the First Amendment means, to suggest that somehow I'm an extremist for trying to restore some balance and to get back to a place where a flood of campaign cash shouldn't be allowed to influence elections, I don't think is extreme. In fact, I think it reflects
I'd like to respond to that, if I might.
Yes, you have time.
George Will is no extremist.
I didn't
He's a reputable columnist. And Senator, you've raised $9 million in campaign donations in the past 4 or 5 years. I'd like to ask this audience to raise your hand if
we're not using
Well, don't raise your hand, but I'll ask the TV audience. Raise your hand if you're $9 million better off. I think it's quite interesting that he brings up the flood of cash in politics. $9 million, Senator.
I wish I had raised $9 million. You exaggerate my success quite a bit, and I appreciate that.
That's the public record.
That's an inaccurate citing of the public record, Mr. Wade.
I'm sure the press will check it out tomorrow.
Last point on this issue, we need to wrap up and move to student questions.
The important difference is all of my contributions are transparent and publicly available in terms of who made them, when, and where they are employed. What Citizens United made possible is millions of dollars of secret contributions where the public has no idea from whence they come.
Okay. We're going to move on to student questions at this point.
Sure.
Our first student question, though, will go to Mr.
Do you have any
Coons.
engineering students?
Possibly. I'm
Very
actually
good.
not sure. All right, that's the end of the first part. From our first student question, it comes from Phoebe Lucas, who is a freshman political science major from the University of Delaware.
In light of the White House recently launching their It's On Us campaign, what do you think that Congress can do to support the movement against sexual assault and rape on college campuses?
Your answer.
I think it is important that Congress join campus leaders in making our campuses safe for young women and young men, to insist on accountability and transparency, to make sure that those campuses that often largely rely on federal funds, whether for grants for higher education or investments in research, that they abide by the law and that they investigate, prosecute, and deal responsibly with sexual assaults on campus. So I think this is an important initiative and it deserves our attention and focus.
But let's expand let's expand the safety zone beyond the campus. I had the great opportunity to speak to an inspiring young woman just a few weeks ago, Amy Day. She heads an organization called Meet Me at the Well. And she's out there supporting women who have to prostitute themselves along Route 9 or Route 13 because they have no place to go and they're on the edge of a drug addiction and they live in a world of violence and fear. If we're going to provide a safe zone for women, let's make it everywhere, Senator. Let's not just, it's a good question, but let's expand it everywhere in Delaware for every woman. Thanks.
All right, now we'll go to our second student question, and it's the issue of immigration reform. And the question comes from Shoshana Simone, a senior political science major at Delaware State University.
What is your view on immigration reform, and what action steps do you plan to advocate for if elected into office?
And Mr. Wade, your response is first.
I had the opportunity to learn a great lesson by going to the southern border just 5 or 6 weeks ago. I had my boots in the Rio Grande. I met with ranchers and shopkeepers, law enforcement and sheriffs. And we have a broken border, and it's hurting people on both sides. Because we don't have effective border security, it has created a vacuum. And that vacuum is being filled by the Gulf and Zeta cartels who control passage across the border from the southern side. And everyone who crosses must pay hundreds and thousands of dollars or carry drugs. That explains part of this flood of heroin that's touching so many homes and neighborhoods in Delaware. And with women, well, they have to use their body. It's an ugly scene. We have to secure the border so that we can stop hurting people on both sides. And we have to get realistic about that needs to be done first, because that's first in the minds of the people in America.
Mr. Coons?
We do have a real border security issue that deserves to be addressed. And as a senator, I've worked in a bipartisan way with Republican senators like John McCain and Jeff Flake and Marco Rubio and colleagues in my party to introduce, amend, strengthen, and pass a broad bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill, first through the Judiciary Committee on which I serve and then through the Senate of the United States. And it invests significantly in strengthening border security, in nearly doubling the size of the Border Patrol, but also in providing a path forward for the nearly 12 million people in the United States illegally that allows us to identify, detain, and deport those who are dangerous, and to set in place a long-term path where those who are here illegally can confess to their crime, pay a fine, learn English, and go to the back of the line. This is a bipartisan compromise that I think is worthy of our continuing to advance.
Because of the topic, we're going to stick with this for a follow-up question from Lindsay Hoffman, and it'll go to Mr. Coons first.
On the issue of children crossing the border without their parents, some of them are even finding refuge in Delaware. What should be done in this situation, and what does it tell us about our immigration policies?
It tells us that we have badly broken immigration situations, both our law and our border. Fortunately, in the last couple of months, the number of young children coming from 3 Central American countries where there's a huge amount of drug and gang violence has dropped precipitously, partly because we've strengthened the Border Patrol, partly because we've invested in speeding up their immigration reviews, and so we're sifting out those with legitimate asylum claims from those who need to be returned to their home countries, and partly because we have invested in educating their parents that they're not guaranteed to stay here, that they don't have a free pass towards citizenship or residency in the United States. What do we need to do? We need to respect and enforce the law as it exists on the book, which requires that those who present legitimate asylum claims in the best spiritual traditions of the United States get a chance at being refugees here, and those who don't have legitimate asylum claims get heard and returned to their countries of origin. This is a difficult situation, but one where I'm proud that the United States has acted in keeping with its best traditions of embracing immigrants while still working to secure America.
Mr. Wade?
Our first priority is for 300 million Americans who would like to be first in their own lines. Our priority is to stop this chaos at the border. I was at the border. I met a young ranching family. Sheriff Martinez of Valverde County was with me. Their young daughter found, well, a colored piece of paper on the ranch property 2 miles north of the Rio Grande, backcountry Texas. And that colored piece of paper was a freshly printed 10 real note from the Bank of Oman. Why is Middle East currency being found in backcountry Texas? It's because we have a broken border. And it's not working, Chris. Washington isn't working. It's time to put Americans and Delawareans first. That's what I will do as the senator for Delaware, to be their voice, not a Republican voice, not a Democrat voice, but their voice in Delaware. And that's what we desperately need.
We're going to move on to our next student question. This question concerns federal and local law enforcement, and it comes from Michael Nichols, a sophomore business management major at Delaware State University.
Should the federal government provide local police forces with military-style weapons?
Mr. Wade, you're first on this response.
The answer is no. We don't want to militarize our police force. Our police should be representing the best nature of those in our society. In fact, the original meaning of the word is to simply clean up the area and make it nicer, to police an area. We don't need heavy weapons. We don't need armored vehicles that apparently some police forces around the country are getting. We're building a wall of separation, a wall of tension between the people and their police forces. No, we don't militarize the police. It's a very simple answer.
Mr. Coons?
I think it's important that we understand the premise of the question. Ferguson was a heart-rending situation in Missouri where the visual image of the police response to protesters was one where they were seen to be aggressive and militarized. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is a long-standing federal program of taking surplus military equipment and providing it to local law enforcement. As someone who co-chairs the Law Enforcement Caucus and has met with police chiefs up and down our state, I can tell you that some of that equipment has been essential to Delaware's safety and Delaware's response to natural disasters. So in some communities where a Humvee, for example, a surplus military Humvee is provided, it's used to evacuate a seaside community as Superstorm Sandy is bearing down. Is that over-militarizing our police? I don't think so. I think what we need to do is separate out that equipment that is uniquely military that probably should not be provided to local police, and that equipment which helps provide its capacity to respond to crises, whether man-made or natural.
Let's stick with this and have a follow-up on this point.
Yeah, let's talk about gun deaths in the U.S. A study released last year revealed that the United States had more guns and gun deaths than any other developed country in the world. What can we do to reduce gun violence?
And Mr. Coons, you answer this first.
Well, I stand with law enforcement in calling for a stronger system of background checks, of making sure that we don't allow those who are mentally ill, those who've been adjudicated of being intent on causing harm to others, who have felony records, to have easy access to weapons. We have to balance the fundamental freedoms of the Second Amendment, which is an individual right, with keeping our communities safe. Nobody wants to take away the guns of those who have them for sport or self-protection, who are law-abiding citizens. But we can and should do more to knock down straw purchases that allow those who are prevented from buying guns legally to get them illegally, to work more strongly with local communities to combat the things that lead to violent crime, and to ensure that we're not allowing guns to get in the hands of criminals as easily as we currently do.
Mr. Wade?
Well, I'm glad that Senator Coons and I both share respect for the Second Amendment. These tragic outbursts of violence that we've seen around the country tie, in most cases, directly to untreated and serious mental illness. The problem is not the National Rifle Association, it's not the Second Amendment, it's not lawful ownership of a firearm. The problem is we have too many people who are in this community and communities across the country who are seriously mentally ill, and they can't get the treatment they need to help them and prevent harm to themselves as well as harm to the community. It's a mental health issue, and it's a leadership issue, and it's a public health issue.
We're going to move on to the next student question, and it comes from Elizabeth Zendek, a junior environmental and energy policy major here at the University of Delaware, and this is about the sea level rise.
As an environmentally conscious student, I was wondering if you could elaborate on your plan to mitigate the effects of sea level rise.
Mr. Wade, you have the first response.
Well, I live in a very old town here in Delaware. It's called Old Newcastle, founded by the Dutch, and the Dutch have an expression in Holland. I've worked there in the past. God made the world, but the Dutch made Holland, and that was by a series of levees and polders and dikes. And the first thing they did when they came to Newcastle 300 years ago is they built a levee, they built a dike to actually drain some of the swamps. The struggle that man has with water, with rivers, with the seacoast is never ending. It's always been with us. As an engineer who needs to professionally follow the science and the data wherever it leads, I remain a very informed but very skeptical person in terms of man-made global warming driving a rise in sea level. There's a study that's been used, unfortunately, and I truly mean unfortunately, by some people here in Delaware to alarm people about a potential 5-foot rise in sea level, but I've read that study. The study concludes that sea level is rising off the coast of Delaware, but not off the coast of New York City, and I can't quite balance this as good science.
Mr. Coons?
Too much to respond to there. God may have made the world, but man is making the climate steadily change. We experienced something called subsidence off the coast of Delaware that's causing our land to go down at the same time that the water is rising, and that accounts for the distinction between what's happening off some of the northeastern coast of the United States and what's happening off the coast of Delaware. Towns like Newcastle, Wilmington, Lewis, and many others up and down our state, as the lowest mean elevation state in the country, will face significant impacts from climate change in the coming decades. I've worked hard in the Senate as a member of the Energy Committee my first 2 years to propose and seek passage of a clean energy standard, new ways to finance renewable and clean energy, and ways for us to responsibly step up and deal on an international basis with the very real challenge to the future of our world presented by climate change. It's my hope that we can find a bipartisan path on this going forward, but those who claim to be well-educated, well-grounded scientists, yet still skeptics over an area where there is an overwhelming scientific consensus are disappointing because they frankly stand as barriers in the way of real progress.
We're moving on to our next student question.
I'd like to respond.
Well,
I work
if
in
you
the
have
area
a
of
point
science
to
and
respond,
technology, and
in
there
the
are
interest
people
of the
who
rules,
are informed,
however,
who are very
I need to ask you to
legitimate,
make that
who
point
do
in your
not
closing
believe
statement,
this,
Mr. Wade.
because it's
I
a
need to move on.
quasi-religious view.
I need to move on. It's out of respect to the rules that we all agreed upon. The next question on ethanol's future comes from Chris Lemieux, a senior biochemistry major at the University of Delaware.
Considering the role of big oil in the government, if ethanol technology is perfected, do you think it could eventually supplant gasoline as the dominant form of fuel?
Mr. Coons, you have the first response.
Well, to Chris's point, as the only chemist in the Senate, I'm very optimistic that cellulosic ethanol and other forms, for example, biobutanol, where our own DuPont and a number of other companies in Delaware and the region are real leaders, will eventually replace gasoline, although the scale is dramatic. We are in the most early stages of developing wide-scale production of things like biobutanol and cellulosic ethanol, and it will be a long time before they could replace gasoline. But I am optimistic that plant-based rather than petroleum-based fuels in the long term will be the most reliable, most renewable, most sustainable source of fuel for our future.
Mr. Wade?
As the only engineer sitting here, it'll never happen. The amount of fuel that we need to propel this economy far outstrips our ability to raise cellulose, corn. I believe in an energy policy that includes all sources, but they have to compete, they have to be competitive, they have to meet our needs. Washington can't pick winners and losers because it always gets it wrong. We have an abundance of oil. We've become the world's largest oil producer. The starting wage, not the minimum wage, the starting wage in North Dakota is $15 an hour. This is what a booming economy does, but we can't close our eyes to the possibilities of the treasures that lay beneath the ground here in this country. I like pipe dreams, but only in children's novels.
We'll move on to a student question from the University of Delaware. This comes from senior international relations major Jordan Levison, and the question is about college tuition rates.
So as a student at the University of Delaware, I'm concerned with the rising tuition rates, and I was wondering, both candidates, what your positions were on how to cope with that.
Mr. Wade, you have the first response.
I think we need to ask the administrators of this university and colleges across the country to understand that it's someone's money that they're charging for this tuition. They have allowed tuition rates, the cost of tuition, the cost of higher education to rise faster than the cost of living over the past 10 and 20 years. And it's a reaction to people who are desperately trying to find a path forward in their lives because of the lack of blue-collar jobs. So people rush to college and they're willing to pay anything to get that degree. And unfortunately, too many people graduate from not only this school but other schools unable to find a job much different than they would have gotten coming out of high school without the college education, but burdened with the debt. We need to talk to our leaders in academia and ask them to do a little bit more with a little bit less to give a real break to our students.
Mr. Coons? We
need to sustain and strengthen the federal-state partnership in providing funding for higher education. As the federal government continues its historic role in providing through Pell Grants billions of dollars every year to make higher education affordable, states across the country have actually receded in terms of their support for higher education. So we've got this difficult situation where tuitions continue to rise, the amount of student aid and state support for state universities like this one continues to drop, and the costs of a higher education and its importance in an increasingly competitive economy only go up. I have co-sponsored legislation that would give access to lower interest rate federally subsidized or guaranteed loans and that would seek to, frankly, penalize those for-profit colleges which are not doing the best by the best interests of their students. There's more we can and should do to reduce the rate of growth of tuition, but frankly, sustaining the federal role in providing access to affordable, quality higher education is my first priority.
I think Lindsay Hoffman and I both have lots of issues we would like to follow up on with both of you, but we are at the point now for closing statements. So each of you will have 1 minute for a closing statement. We begin with you, Kevin Wade. You will have the first.
Well, thank you for your questions tonight. I much enjoyed it. Thank you for being with me tonight. The problem today in America is that our leaders in Washington no longer believe in us. But we believe in each other, and all of us together will see that we get our way through this most dangerous and disturbing time that we're in with Ebola and broken borders and ISIS. I went to work in a steel mill 3 days after high school. I climbed the ladder of opportunity right here in Delaware. Every good thing in my life happened because of that climb. I spent 40 years in manufacturing, from the factory floor to the boardroom. I know how to create high-wage, blue-collar jobs. I know we need to give parents real choice in education, and that's a voucher. I know we need to secure the border. I know how real is the threat of Ebola here and Islamist terrorists there and here. And I know we need honest, experienced leadership in Washington. On Election Day, send a message that we're going to set things right. We won't live in fear, and we won't be deceived. God bless all of you, and may God save the United States of America.
Mr. Coons, you have 1 minute.
Thanks for coming tonight, and to everyone who listened and who watched, and to Nancy and to Lindsay for moderating. Tonight, I hope you learned a bit more about my vision for Delaware and my record of service, about why I'm seeking my first full term in the Senate. I believe in Delaware's workers, and I believe that we can invent things and grow things and make things in this state again. That's why every day I'm fighting hard to help the private sector create good jobs. I believe every young Delawarean deserves the same opportunity to succeed, which means making sure more kids get to college and can afford it when they get there. It's not easy to get things done in Washington, but when I'm able to break through the gridlock and to help our volunteer fire service get some relief from the new health care law or secure funding to help save our state's child advocacy centers, I know I'm making a difference in the lives of people I care about. The only way we're going to get things done in Washington is to work together. If I'm fortunate enough to earn your vote on November 4th, I'll keep working to find common ground, reach across the aisle, and get real things done for this great state of ours. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Lindsay Hoffman for joining me here, and also to Jason Mykoff, who was at the table with me earlier, also to our audience here in Mitchell Hall. I am Nancy Karibjanian, so on behalf of Delaware Public Media, WDDE 91.1 FM, and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communications, thank you very much for joining us.
Delaware Debates is a joint initiative of the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication and WDDE 91.1 FM, Delaware Public Media, with support from American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, and the William P. Frank Foundation of Delaware.